Hello and welcome to Composers in Quarantine. My name is Amber Broderick, music historian for the Cape Conservatory and Symphony. This Composers in Quarantine series will detail the true stories from music history about composers who faced situations of quarantine, of being restrained, isolated, or constrained in a manner that did not allow them to function as they wished. However, these situations also gave rise to their most incredible, unique, and individual music. Our very first composer is none other than Ludwig van Beethoven. Widely regarded as the greatest composer of all time, Beethoven faced an extreme amount of adversity in his lifetime. Not only did he have to deal with the patronage system of being reliant on wealthy aristocratic patrons for performances, stipend, and even ownership of his music, Beethoven had to deal with his own personal infirmary, his deafness. It's impossible to discuss Beethoven without bringing up this very personal condition. Now, when you or I think about Beethoven, we're probably thinking of Beethoven in his later years. You're thinking the crazy hair, the intensity of expression, the eccentric mannerisms. You might be thinking of him shuffling around Vienna, muttering to himself and gesticulating wildly. This is later era Beethoven. That Beethoven had to withdraw from society and become more introspective and more isolated. But this is the opportunity for achieving a level of musical complexity that had not been experienced yet. So before we talk about that Beethoven, let's back up to young Beethoven. Beethoven in his young 20s. Beethoven came from the country town of Bonn, where he was a musician in the court, and his dream was to come to Vienna and establish himself as a composer and pianist. So he was able to move there at the age of 22 and very quickly established himself as the darling of the aristocratic social set. He was teaching private lessons, he was giving piano classes, and making a name for himself. And in fact, by the time he was 26 years old, he was considered the greatest pianist of all time in all of Europe. There was no one that could beat him. However, as this is happening, Beethoven contracts typhoid at the age of 27 and begins to notice a persistent buzz in his ears. Well, he didn't think a whole lot of it. He'd been ill for most of his life, but it became apparent that the buzz was not going away and was in fact becoming a roar. So at the age of 31, after keeping this a secret for 4 years, he finally writes a letter to a dear friend, a doctor, and tells him there's a terrible roar in his ears. He can no longer hear the extremes, the lows and the highs of instruments, and conversation has become very difficult for him. So Beethoven starts to withdraw from society. He already had a reputation for being a bit eccentric, and people pushed it off as potential rudeness. But really, young Beethoven was absolutely terrified. There had been no instances of deaf composers in all of music history, and he was reliant on the aristocrats for money and housing and commissions. And who was going to give him that stability if he was deaf? Additionally, Beethoven was a young man, and at this time he was extremely social. He loved witty conversation and company. He went out to dinner at the tavern every night, and of course, he loved being with attractive young women. So Beethoven in his late 20s, early 30s effectively saw his entire future disappear. Not only did he think he would not be able to achieve a stable employment, but the ability to obtain a wife just was no longer in the cards for him, and this threw him into absolute despair. His doctor recommended that he take a break from the hustle and bustle of Vienna and to take a country vacation. So he travels to the northern city of Heiligenstadt, which means holy city. And there, Beethoven gave us a document that is just unprecedented. It's now known as the Heiligenstadt Testament. It's a will to his brothers in which he asks them to take care of his instruments and to think well on him, but he also confesses his hearing loss. And he tells them in heartbreaking language how painful it was for him, to the depths of the despair that he was driven. It was unimaginable for Beethoven to have situations where he would be walking with a friend in the country and the friend would remark, "Oh, there's a shepherd piping," and he heard nothing. This drove him to such a level of darkness and despair that Beethoven writes in this Heiligenstadt Testament that he even considered taking his own life. But the only thing that kept him from going through this terrible action was his love of art, that he still had something left to say in his music. So he returns from the summer hiatus to Vienna and just explodes into his new heroic period. And he comes out with his third symphony, the Heroic Symphony. And this really encapsulates the Beethovenian spirit. You have incredible, expansive themes, dynamic contrast. There are tremendously exciting climaxes, and everything is organic. You have a sense that Beethoven is taking you inside and letting you experience emotions as he experienced them. And he does this by taking the primary theme, the very first theme that you hear at the beginning of the symphony, and he treats it like a protagonist. He gives this theme the ability to become a narrative voice, and it starts off very positively. It's a fanfare. Bum, 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 bum. But what's that last note? This stable, strong, fanfare-like theme has this weakness to it, this doubt, this uncertainty of, could he do this? Could he overcome all of the struggle that was ahead of him? And this theme, it tries to ascend, it tries to achieve this final form, and it's continually opposed by other instruments, dissonant, jarring, and they beat it down, and they will not let it rise. And the whole symphony kind of collapses into the sense of despair. And you as the listener, you're right there with Beethoven, and you don't know what's going to happen. But gradually, the theme asserts itself, and it is able to pull itself out of that doubt, and it achieves a new form. This glorious, triumphant, exciting final form where the protagonist is able to overcome all of that adversity and just soar above. It's an incredible movement, and nothing like that had ever been composed before. It was truly a landmark. And then Beethoven was on fire. He could not be stopped for the next decade of his life. He composed symphonies 3 through 8. He wrote his only opera, Fidelio. He gave us most of his piano sonatas, including all the ones we know, the Moonlight, the Appassionata, the Hammerklavier, the Waldstein, and the piano concertos. So Beethoven, his audiences were able to read in that symphony this dynamicism as a portrayal of their own social and spiritual struggle, because the aristocrats, their society is collapsing and the middle class is rising. So Beethoven is kind of like this world spirit that encapsulates humanity's struggles, their sorrows, but their ultimate, their joy and their triumph. So Beethoven's music becomes transcendent. And the only way that it becomes transcendent is the fact that he has to withdraw. He has to isolate, because that gives him access to this headspace that only Beethoven can unlock. And he gives us this experience that is absolutely unparalleled. He gives us the spirit of humanity, this inconquerable, indomitable will. So that's why we can't talk about Beethoven as a composer without talking about his deafness. And even in his greatest symphony, the Symphony Number 9, we have this wonderful story that's true, that he had to be turned by one of the singers on stage to acknowledge the applause for his masterpiece. So the Symphony Number 9 premiered in 1824. That was Beethoven's last public appearance. But he was revered by not just the Austrians, but the entire country by that point. If he had not had to undergo his hearing loss crisis and to make sacrifices, such as never marrying and not being able to socialize the way he wanted to, he would not have composed the music that he did in the manner that he did. So I think Beethoven's message to us is persevere, endure, and it's all going to be beautiful in the end. Thank you.